The night had been long, cold, and restless. Most of the women had barely slept, if they slept at all. The train that carried them west had rattled and groaned like an exhausted animal, its metal frame shuddering each time it changed tracks. The women sat pressed shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in worn coats that still carried the smoke and dust of a collapsing Germany. No one spoke much. There was nothing left to say. By the time the train slowed, the sun was only a faint blue glow on the horizon. The women shielded their eyes as the doors slid open and crisp morning air rushed inside. It wasn't bitter like the German winter they remembered. It smelled different, clean, sharp, almost sweet. They stepped down one by one, boots crunching on gravel. They had finally reached the American camp. For months, rumors had drifted across Europe about what American captivity was like. Some claimed the Americans were strict but fair. Others whispered about kindness that felt suspicious, as if it must hide some trick. And then there were the darker rumors, the ones the Nazi propaganda had fed them for years, warning that the Americans would treat German prisoners like animals. But the women saw none of that as they walked toward the low wooden buildings ahead. Instead, they saw a group of American guards waiting in loose formation. Their uniforms looked newer, cleaner. Their faces were calm. A few even nodded politely as the women passed. It made the prisoners slow down, unsure whether they should react or keep staring at the ground. Inside the camp, the faint smell of smoke drifted across the yard, not from burning buildings like they had grown used to, but from something more comforting. Some of the women lifted their heads. They smelled food, real food, warm food, the kind of smell that stirred memories they had been trying to forget, memories of breakfast tables, kitchens, families, normal life. They didn't dare believe it. An American sergeant motioned for them to continue walking. His voice was steady and firm, but not harsh. "This way, ladies, we'll get you settled." Some of the women exchanged glances. Ladies? It had been a long time since anyone had called them that. They moved through the yard toward a long, low building that looked like a dining hall. Light spilled from the windows in soft golden rectangles. The smell grew stronger, eggs, bread, something faintly sweet. A few women swallowed hard, their stomachs tightened. Some hadn't had a proper meal in days, others in weeks. They reached the entrance and hesitated. A guard stepped aside and gestured toward the door. "Go on in, breakfast is ready." The prisoners froze. "Ready? For them?" Inside, the hall was warm. A small stove crackled with coal in the corner, glowing orange. Long wooden tables lined the room, each with clean tin plates arranged neatly in rows. A handful of American cooks moved between the tables, carrying trays, setting things down, adjusting utensils. The women stared. One of the cooks, a young man with sleeves rolled to his elbows, looked up and offered a small smile. It confused them more than anything else so far. Smiles had been rare in Germany's final months. They felt foreign now, almost frightening in their unfamiliarity. The sergeant raised his hand and addressed the room. "You'll all get a hot breakfast. Sit anywhere, coffee at the end of the line." Again, the women hesitated. Their hands hovered at their sides. They didn't know whether they were supposed to wait for orders, stand in line, or stay still until someone pointed them where to go. They had lived under strict discipline for so long that even kindness felt like a rule they didn't understand. Finally, one woman stepped forward, then another. They approached the tables slowly, almost timidly, and sat down. A steam rose from the tin plates. Scrambled eggs, yellow and fluffy. Slices of bread that looked soft, not the coarse dark ration loaves they were used to. A few pieces of fruit, a luxury they hadn't held in months. And a metal cup ready to be filled with coffee. The first woman who reached for her plate stopped when her hand trembled visibly. She gently touched the edge of the tin, as if making sure it wasn't a trick. Then she whispered something so soft, that only the women near her heard it. "Sie geben uns das wirklich. They're really giving this to us." An American soldier walked by and filled her cup with hot coffee. The smell rose like a warm cloud, rich and unfamiliar. She stared up at him, eyes wide, unsure what to say. He nodded politely. "Ma'am." The word struck her like a shock. "Ma'am. Not prisoner. Not enemy. Not German. Just ma'am." Another woman pressed her hands together to steady herself. One shook her head softly, whispering, "Ich glaub das nicht. I don't believe this." A few women looked around the room, searching for the catch, the hidden threat, the part where kindness turned into something else. But nothing happened. The Americans just kept serving food, walking between the tables, checking if the plates had enough on them. Some of the women stared at the eggs in disbelief. Eggs had become a distant memory by the end of the war. They were something you talked about but never saw, something that belonged to the world before bombings, cold nights, and empty cupboards. The sergeant walked by again, his voice calm. "Eat up, there's more if you need it." More. That word almost hurt. For months they had lived with less. Less food, less warmth, less hope. And now, in the first hours of their captivity, the Americans were offering them more. One woman lifted the fork to her mouth, paused, and looked at the others. They shared the same expression, fear mixed with wonder, suspicion blended with hunger. She took a small bite, then another. Her eyes softened. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Across the table, another woman clutched her coffee cup with both hands, feeling the heat seep into her fingers. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the warmth remind her that she was still alive. The room grew quiet except for the soft clink of utensils, the occasional sigh, and the distant crackle of the stove. It was the sound of women tasting normal life again after months of chaos. None of them said it aloud, but they all felt the same thought rising inside them. If this is how the Americans start the day, what else is waiting for us here? The morning sun pushed through the windows, illuminating the steam rising from their plates like a small miracle. It was only breakfast, but for the women who had survived the last months of a collapsing world, it felt like something far greater. Something they had forgotten existed. Something they didn't think they'd ever experience again. Kindness, warmth, humanity. They weren't ready to believe it yet. But as they ate, many of them realized something quietly, almost painfully simple. This was the first moment in a very long time that they felt safe. As the women ate, the tension in their shoulders slowly eased. Not completely, not fully. Years of fear couldn't disappear in minutes, but enough that the room began to feel less like a place of captivity and more like a place of waiting for something they couldn't name yet. A few of the American cooks stepped aside to lean against the counter. They watched the women with a quiet attention, not curious in a mocking way, but in a human one. Many of the soldiers had never seen female prisoners before. Some were barely older than the women sitting at the tables. They were trying to be respectful, trying to figure out what kindness looked like during wartime. One of the cooks, a tall young man with sandy hair, nudged his friend and whispered, "They look like they haven't eaten in weeks." His friend replied, "Maybe they haven't." The prisoners didn't hear the exchange. They were too focused on the plates in front of them. One woman took such small bites that it looked like she was afraid the food might run out if she wasn't careful. Another blew gently on her coffee as though savoring even the warmth rising from it. A third woman sat with her hands trembling on her lap for a long time, staring at her meal before finally lifting the fork. Not one of them rushed. Not one took anything for granted. At the far end of the table, a woman named Helga, who had spent the last months hiding in ruined buildings before being captured, held a piece of fruit in her hand. An apple, perfectly shaped, smooth skin. She turned it over slowly, staring at it as if it were an object from another world. One of the American soldiers approached and pointed to the apple with a gentle nod. "You can have it," he said. "It's yours." Helga swallowed hard. "Ours," she repeated in a small voice. "That's right." She hesitated. In Germany's last months, fruit had been a memory, something children dreamed about, something adults joked about bitterly, and now it sat in her hand, bright and clean and real. She pressed her lips together, then finally brought it close and inhaled its scent. A simple gesture, but her eyes watered instantly. She blinked it away quickly, wiping her face with her sleeve before anyone could notice. But the soldier saw. He didn't say anything. He only nodded again and walked away, giving her space. Nearby, another woman whispered to the one sitting beside her, "I forgot what apples smell like." The woman nodded, unable to speak. Across the hall, an older woman named Marta prayed under her breath. She wasn't religious, not strongly at least, but gratitude came easier in murmurs when words felt too heavy. She kept her hands folded near her chest, her plate untouched for a moment. When she finally picked up her fork, she paused, closed her eyes, and tasted her food with a slow reverence only those who have truly hungered can understand. The American sergeant walked between the tables again. "If any of you need more, just raise a hand," he said calmly. His voice carried but didn't echo. The hall was warm and soft enough to absorb the sound. A few of the women glanced up at him, unsure whether he meant what he said. More. In Germany there had been less and less until even nothing became familiar. The idea of abundance felt suspicious, like a rule they weren't supposed to break. One woman, a quiet girl barely 20, timidly lifted her cup. "May I have more coffee?" she asked softly, almost apologizing for the question. The sergeant nodded. "Of course." She watched him pour the hot liquid back into her cup. She couldn't stop staring at the steady stream, rising steam warming her face. When he was done, she lowered her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." The sergeant smiled. "You're welcome." She didn't remember the last time someone had spoken to her gently. At another table, a woman named Annelies, who had once worked in a bakery before the war consumed her life, held a slice of bread in both hands. She felt the soft texture, the warmth lingering from the oven. She tore off a small piece and tasted it. Her eyes widened. "This is fresh," she said, staring at the bread as though it had spoken. "They bake this here." The woman beside her nodded, chewing slowly. "Not like ours, this is soft." "American bread is always soft," another woman whispered. "My mother used to say that." "Your mother?" someone asked. "She was in America for a few years before the war." The table fell quiet. That kind of story felt like it belonged to another lifetime. But even the idea of America sounded impossibly distant and bright. A place filled with images from magazines and stories of plenty. A place none of them expected to ever see, except now the simplicity of this breakfast made it feel real in a way that frightened and comforted them at the same time. The women continued to eat slowly, cautiously. The Americans didn't rush them. They let the room fill with a calm that none of the prisoners had felt in months. And as the minutes passed, something even more surprising began to happen. A few women started to speak softly among themselves. Only small sentences at first, questions, observations, quiet comments about the food, about the warmth, about the strange feeling of sitting at a clean table again. The conversations were broken and hesitant, but they sounded almost normal, almost like the war wasn't pressing against the walls outside. One woman lifted a small spoonful of eggs and whispered to the others, "I used to make these for my children before everything fell apart." Another woman nodded. I used to make coffee for my husband before he left for the front. A third woman looked into her cup and shook her head lightly. I used to think I'd never taste this again. These weren't grand statements. They were fragments of lives almost forgotten, drifting slowly back into memory as warmth returned to their bodies. Then something unexpected happened. A few of the American soldiers stepped outside to bring in additional trays. When they returned, the cold air followed them in, brushing across the room. One of the women shivered, not from the cold, but from the realization of how warm she had grown sitting there. Warm enough to feel safe. Warm enough to breathe without fear. Warm enough to think clearly for the first time in months. As she looked at her plate again, at the eggs, the fruit, the bread, the coffee, then she said quietly, almost to herself, "I thought the Americans would hate us." Across the table, Helga nodded slowly. "I did too, but the evidence in front of them disagreed." And as the morning continued, another truth became even clearer. If this was the beginning of captivity, then captivity was nothing like what they had imagined. The hall grew quieter as the last bites disappeared from the plates, not silent, never silent, but different. The nervous energy that had followed the women since their capture slowly unwound, shoulders lowered, hands relaxed, backs that had been stiff for days softened into the wooden benches. Some of the women placed their utensils neatly on their plates, unsure what to do next. They waited for commands that didn't come. The Americans didn't bark orders, didn't tell them to rise, didn't hurry them toward the door. The soldiers simply moved between tables, clearing empty cups and checking the coffee urns. One young American private, carrying a tray stacked with empty plates, paused beside a table where two women sat staring at their empty cups. "You want more?" he asked gently. The women exchanged glances, surprised he was even offering. One shook her head quickly, unsure if they were allowed to accept more. The other hesitated, then softly said, If it is permitted, a little more coffee." "It's permitted," the private replied with a small nod. "You're our guests now." "Guests?" The word sank into the room like warm water into dry soil. The young woman looked down, hiding the emotion that suddenly tightened her throat. She whispered, "Dank," and the private nodded again, pretending he didn't see her wipe her eyes with the back of her hand. At another table, an older woman leaned forward, elbows on the wood, palms pressed together beneath her chin. She stared at the empty plate in front of her, trying to wrap her mind around what she had just eaten. The eggs had been real, the bread soft, the coffee warm. For the first time in months, maybe even years, her stomach felt full. Full? That alone felt like a miracle. She whispered, "I don't know how to behave here." The woman beside her nodded in agreement. "I don't either." In Germany at the end of the war, everything had become rigid and fearful. Food was rationed, movement was restricted, kindness was scarce. People watched each other's faces for signs of despair, of madness, of hunger turning into desperation. Even the smallest gesture felt monitored. But here, in this warm wooden hall, the rules were different. One American sergeant stood by the doorway, arms loosely crossed, not guarding the door, simply watching to make sure no one needed anything. He didn't stand rigidly. His shoulders were relaxed, his steps slow. It wasn't the posture of a man watching enemies. It was the posture of a man watching over people. The women noticed. One whispered to another, "He doesn't look like a guard." The other replied, "He looks like someone making sure we're safe." The idea felt absurd. They were prisoners. The Americans were soldiers. Safety wasn't part of the equation they had imagined, but the warmth, the food, the gentle voices, they spoke a different truth. In the middle of the room, a soft laugh broke the air. It was small, unsure, almost accidental. A young woman named Lot had been trying to pick up her cup when her hand bumped the side of the plate, making a faint clink. Embarrassed, she covered her mouth quickly, but a quiet laugh escaped anyway. The other women at her table turned toward her with wide eyes. Laughter was dangerous in the last days of war. It drew attention. It made you look out of touch with suffering, or worse, naive. But here no one scolded her. An American cook near the stove glanced over, saw the women's startled reaction, and simply smiled. Not a mocking smile, a human one, a smile that said it was okay. Lot lowered her hands slowly, her face red, but when the cook nodded reassuringly, she exhaled in relief. "Entschuldigung," she whispered automatically. "No need," the cook said softly. "You're fine." The women didn't respond immediately. They needed a moment to process the fact that nothing bad had happened. Little by little, the tension in the room shifted. A few women looked at each other and exchanged small smiles, fragile, hesitant smiles, but real ones. They weren't used to feeling safe enough to show emotion. They weren't used to rooms where laughter didn't put a target on your back. In the far corner, Helga took another sip of coffee, holding the cup with both hands. Her fingers were still stiff from cold nights in bombed-out buildings, but the warmth seeped into her knuckles, easing the ache. She looked up and watched as two American soldiers pushed in another cart of supplies, more fruit, more bread, more coffee. As she whispered, "They expect us to eat more." "Maybe," Marta replied quietly, "they expect us to live." That sentence lingered in the air long after Marta finished speaking. For a long time, many of the women hadn't expected anything beyond survival. They had seen their hometowns burned, their families scattered, their futures shattered. In those final months, Germany felt like a place where life had stopped and suffering was the only rhythm left. But the Americans were offering something unfamiliar. A consistency. Warmth, routine. Even the simple act of eating breakfast together, unhurried, unpunished, undisturbed, felt like the first step toward remembering what normal life had once felt like. The stove crackled softly in the corner. Outside, the morning light brightened through the frost-coated windows. A bird landed on the sill, shaking its feathers before flying away. The prisoners noticed the detail, small as it was. They had lived through months of explosions, gunfire, screams in the night. Quiet moments had become strange luxuries. The sergeant stepped forward again, tapping his hand lightly against the doorway. "All right, ladies," he said, voice steady. "When you're finished, we'll take you to get cleaned up and settled." The words hung in the air. Cleaned up, settled. The women exchanged looks. Was that possible? Could the Americans really mean it? A few of them instinctively lifted their hands to their hair, feeling the dust tangled in it. Others touched their clothes, worn and stiff from weeks of travel. Some lowered their eyes, embarrassed by their appearance. They had survived the war, but survival had carved them down to exhaustion. Was the next miracle really going to be a bath? The idea seemed unreal, too generous, too much for prisoners. Helga's voice broke the silence at her table. "What kind of place is this?" she whispered. Marta answered without looking up. "A place where the war may finally be over." And slowly, as they rose from their seats, some steady on their feet, others trembling but determined, each woman felt a quiet truth forming inside her. If breakfast had been this unexpected, then the rest of the day might change their understanding of everything.